Good afternoon. My name is Robert Post, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you here to a discussion about the role of religion in American public life. Before I introduce our guest speakers and our moderator, I want to give you some background about the series of which today's discussion forms a part, and that is the Yale Law School's Debating Law and Religion series. That series began in the year 2011 as a forum for speakers to discuss topical issues about the relationship between law and religion, and also about the role of religion in modern life. And over several years, Professor Patrick Vai, who visits with us every year from Paris, and the team of student organizers that he led, have done really an outstanding job of encouraging respectful debate about these very important but very fraught issues. And we have been very fortunate to host an accomplished series of speakers who have participated in discussions on topics as diverse as, for example, the Islamic Community Center at Ground Zero in New York City, the legal ban on headscarves and burqas in France, the role of religion in public reason, the place of religion in ancient Roman and Hindu civilizations, and sanctions on hate speech directed at religious groups. Each of these sessions has played to a packed house, like the house here today. The popularity of the series that Patrick has created highlights, I think, the importance that thinking persons place on understanding the role of religion in modern life. The many cases about religion that have been decided by our Supreme Court just in the last year alone, cases like Holt and Hobby Lobby and Greece, are simply the tip of the iceberg. These cases concern religious rights in the law, but the deeper issues are how religion influences our conception of duty and character, of morality, and of responsibility. The United States is, as I'm sure you know, by far the most religious of any of the developed nations. And this means that we have to think seriously about what our religious commitments mean for us. How do they affect our concept of public service? How are they compatible with our commitment to a secular state? How do religious and civic obligations harmonize with each other? How does faith coexist with the sovereignty of the democratic people? How do we set precedents between our commitments to God and to the law? How do religious persons from different faiths accommodate each other, much less accommodate those who oppose religious faith altogether? It's a very, very great privilege to have here today three of our country's most respected thinkers and public servants, all Yale Law School graduates, all men of faith and religious commitment, and all three to discuss the role of religion in public service in the United States at this time. And it is my hope that they will also illuminate for us how their faith has influenced their own public actions and decisions. Our first speaker is Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas. You might remember that Justice Thomas was here with us just 4 months ago when he received the Yale Law School Award of Merit. He has served on the Supreme Court since his appointment by President George W. Bush in 1991, but his life as a public servant began right after his graduation from this law school in 1974, when he went to work for then Attorney General of Missouri, John Danforth. Justice Thomas went on to become a legislative assistant to the newly elected Senator Danforth. After a short stint in the private sector, Justice Thomas returned to the public service as Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the Department of Education in 1981, and he then became the chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission in 1982. And after several years at the EEOC, he was appointed to the DC Circuit and then the Supreme Court. In his 2007 memoir, My Grandfather's Son, Justice Thomas describes the role that religion has played in his life. He discusses his Catholic upbringing, his decision to attend a seminary, at the age of 16. And he speaks of the strength that he draws from his faith in order to overcome personal and professional challenges. Regarding his decision to leave the seminary and his faith as a young man, Justice Thomas writes, and I'm quoting him now, "It seemed self-evident that the treatment of blacks in America cried out for the unequivocal condemnation of a righteous institution that proclaimed the inherent equality of all men. Yet the church remained silent, and its silence haunted me. I have often thought that my life might well have followed a different route had the church been as adamant about ending racism then as it is about ending abortion now." Later in his book, Justice Thomas describes how he relied on his faith through the ordeal of his Supreme Court nomination. He says, and I'm quoting him, "Each day, I left the caucus room tired, tormented, and anxious. After years of rejecting God, I'd slowly eased into a state of quiet ambivalence toward him. But that wasn't good enough anymore. I had to go the whole way. I recalled one of Daddy's sayings, 'Hard times make monkey eat cayenne pepper.' I ate the pepper of faith, and I found it sweet." In his memoir, Justice Thomas also chronicles his longtime personal and professional relationship with our second speaker, the Reverend John Danforth. John Danforth has enjoyed a long and distinguished career as a public servant. He's the author of a book entitled Faith and Politics: How the Moral Values Debate Divides America and How to Move Forward Together. Reverend Danforth received degrees from the Yale Law School and from the Yale Divinity School, both in 1963, when he became an ordained Episcopalian priest, and when he passed the bar. Like Justice Thomas, Jack Danforth considered the ministry, but ultimately chose to make a career in government service and the law. After a few years in private practice, Reverend Danforth was elected the Attorney General of Missouri at the age of 32. He went on to serve in the United States Senate for almost 20 years before becoming United States Ambassador to the United Nations. Reverend Danforth has thought long and hard about the role of religion and faith in politics. In his 2005 New York Times editorial entitled "In the Name of Politics," Senator Danforth wrote, and I'm quoting him now, "Republicans have transformed our party into the political arm of conservative Christians. While religions are free to advocate for their own sectarian causes, the work of government and those who engage in it is to hold together as one people a very diverse country. At its best, religion can be a uniting influence, but in practice, nothing is more divisive. For politicians to advance the cause of one religious group is often to oppose the cause of another." Regarding the balance he has struck between his political work and his ministry, Jack Danforth has written, and I'm quoting, "It's very important if you're in public life not to mix up the two. It's very important to not be really a representative of a religious position in government. Religious people are going to be involved in government and in politics, and that's good, and I'm one of them. But I think when you do it, it's important to do it with a great degree of humility and recognize that your point of view is not necessarily God's point of view. It's just your own political point of view." Our moderator today, Sterling Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Second Circuit Court of Appeals Judge Guido Calabresi, has been a Yale Law professor since 1959. And having talked to many, many alums, I can tell you that he is the favorite professor of every single Yale Law graduate since he started teaching here. And in fact, you should know, it was Guido who recommended Clarence Thomas to Guido's former student, Jack Danforth, for a potential job after graduation. Guido is the author of 6 books and more than 100 articles on law and related subjects. And he has also been, as you might know, the dean of this law school, and in my view, should be regarded as the founder of the modern Yale Law School. Guido has spoken widely about religion and the law, including last year at an event co-hosted by the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics and the Washington University School of Law. Guido has emphasized the need to understand the trade-off between the rights of individuals and churches to define themselves and the potential harms that such self-definition may have on others. So I think you can see we have every reason to look forward to a very lively discussion this afternoon. And after the discussion is concluded, I invite you all to a reception in the dining room. I ask only that you wait until the panelists have been able to leave the auditorium before you come to the dining room for the reception. And with that, please join me in welcoming our speakers and our moderator.
So, I want to begin by saying something that Dean has already said, some of those, about how long I've known these kids. I've known Jack for 55 years, since he was in my torts class in the fall of 1960. And I've known Clarence, and I hope you don't mind my calling them by first name, because that's what I called them then, and I can't get over it, just as I hope that you will call, and they will call me Guido. I've known Clarence for 40 years, from the time I put him together with Jack, which has been an amazingly fruitful combination. I want to say something about that to the students here, and especially those who were in my torts class. These two are you in 40 and 55 years. Understand that. You can do all that they have done. That is what we ask of you. That is what we expect of you. And I hope that in 40 and 55 years, since I'm a person of faith, that I will either look down or look up and be able to say that I am as proud of you, whether I agree with you or not, as I am of Clarence and of Jack. That is what I expect of you, as I say, looking up or looking down. So I will ask some questions, they're kind of general to get things going, and I hope that each one of you will just take off from it. If you want to take beyond it and say other things, that's fine. I begin by saying, okay, your faith, both of you, clearly has affected your personal life. I know that because I know how Clarence looks after everyone at the court. Everyone, from cleaning people, law clerks, everyone knows him and loves him because he looks after them. Looks after them as a person of faith does for others. Jack, because of any number of things I know he has done. I remember when there was a student in St. Louis who was in trouble, a gay student who needed help, and I called Jack, and he stepped into it and turned that person's life around. Again, a person who believed first and foremost of looking after others. Okay, in your personal life. But does your faith affect your public life? How does your faith affect what you do in your public life? Clarence, as a judge and a justice. Jack, as a senator, ambassador, attorney general. Clarence?
Well, thank you all for being here. I am forced to call Dean Calabresi Guido, so I will do. You know, that reminds me when I met Justice Marshall, And, you know, Justice Marshall, for all of us, had achieved a status that was iconic. And you did not, and when you're from the South, you were always required to put a handle on people's name or adult's name. This was not just an adult, this was Justice Marshall. And when I met him, he insisted that I called him Thurgood. He said, "I can't call you Thurgood. My grandfather would get after me." He said, if you don't call me Thurgood, I will call you Justice Thomas. So I said, "I will call you Thurgood in your presence, but there is no way I'm going to do it when you're not around." But so in a sense, I have to do that with Guido. That just doesn't sound right, but I'll do it. In many ways, you know, it's interesting. When I was here, I was not very religious, so I can't really say how it affected me over a long period. In fact, if anything, I lost faith. But in reclaiming it, it was something that helped me personally to do the things that were required of me. How I treated other people, how I lived up to my duties and responsibilities, things that Dean Post mentioned in his opening remarks about duty and character, morality and responsibility. It wasn't something, I'm still not a person who believes that I have standing to tell other people, to preach at other people. I think that, if anything, my favorite prayer is a litany of humility. And I have so many reasons to be humble. It's not like I'm working to be humble. I can't, that's where I am. I have no idea what happened to that mic, but I have many reasons to be humble. But I don't see it in public life as something that I try to impose on other people through your laws or through your Constitution. That would actually be a violation of my oath, which I take very seriously, in large part because of my own religious beliefs. It's something that I try to live up to the responsibilities of the job and at each of the jobs I've had. And I also try to I tell my clerks they are there to help me live up to my oath. That's critical to me. And then to have the strength to do it, to have the insights to do it, to have the discipline to work hard enough to sort things through things, to wake up in the middle of the night because this is what's required of us. So I think faith plays that role, but it doesn't play a role in sort of analyzing a case, or I don't allow it. I think it would be a violation of my oath to put it between my interpretation of the Constitution or statutes and say the case itself. It just helps me do what I'm supposed to do properly. And it's something I talk to my clerks about. I see Mara here. Mara is responsible, by the way, for me being, but you know, I thank her. She is really a good person. You try to achieve that sort of goodness in what you do and try to do things right and be ethical. A final point is, I'm a firm believer that actions speak a lot louder than words. I worked for a man whose faith was never up front. In fact, I'm forced to call him Jack too, by the way. Jack was a minister, I knew that, or a priest, I knew that, but he never talked about it. I worked in his office, I worked for him as center, he never said a word about it. There were some days he had to, during the week that he had service or delivered communion to the shut-in, and he would be in late, but he would never say a word about it. When I realized the depth of his faith, it was our closeness during confirmation was the first he ever talked about it. In all the years, he never imposed it on me, and he knew how bad, I mean, I was a tough cookie in a lot of ways. Not a tough cookie in the sense of being a tough person, but I was a tough person to be around. And he somehow dealt with that, but he was the model for how I dealt with things, and he still serves as a model as to how I do things.
Yes, Jack has been a model for many of us. He's been a model for me, and I want to know how he deals with his personal faith in such places as the United States Senate. Not a place which you exactly think of as being a cathedral.
Endurance. Well, Guido, thanks for everything, and for the long-term friendship that we have had. This man has had tremendous effect on my life, and we've stayed close together ever since law school, and we still are, and it's a great blessing to me. And Clarence is just one of God's good people, and I was interested that you mentioned your confirmation. I've been trying to forget it, but you know, I said last night there was a dinner that Robert Post hosted, very nice dinner, and I said, you got to figure out an exit line for the reception after this, because Clarence is going to be the last person to leave the reception, and that is the kind of person he is. He's a real people's person, and he cares about people. Well, I served a lot of years in public office, and it's very interesting that during those years, nobody in my state ever asked me to do anything that was kind of specifically religious. They knew my background, they knew my biography, but nobody ever indicated that they expected that that would yield some sort of specific policy. And I believed that I had been elected to serve all of the people in my state, not just some of them, that I was serving people who had different beliefs or no beliefs at all. That was the job of being in public office, not to try to impose some religious view on people. So I have believed and do believe that it's very important to keep some distance between religious beliefs and specific public policies, because if you don't keep that distance, you tend to invest a public policy with a religious dimension which it does not deserve. And that takes public policy out of the realm of the debatable into the realm of the absolute, where it just does not belong. So I am the sum total of what I am and my background and my education, including this place, and everything that goes into my makeup. And I hope that affects the kind of person I am, but it cannot be viewed as a one-to-one relationship between any public policy that I might believe in.
My next question is very personal, and Clarence has already, and the dean has referred to it to some extent, but it has to do with whether you have had any extended period of doubt about faith and about the relationship between faith and your life, both personal and political, not just those momentary times when one wonders, but an extended period of worry, and of worry that this somehow was not there, that you had lost it. And if so, how did you try to deal with it? How did you deal with those dark moments of not knowing?
Oh, badly. You watch yourself. I was not a pleasant person, and I think I reacted quite negatively and childishly or immaturely to a lot of difficult times, and I didn't see the good in it anymore. And when I first went to the court, I drove in on October 23rd. The chief said he would swear me in. I didn't realize you had all these oaths you had to take. And I knew very little about going there. I was just focused on just surviving. But when I drove in, there was one of the police officers said, "Don't let them steal your joy." And I've always remembered that somehow that sort of lightness, that sort of positive outlook that I'd had even in the South, even as a kid, had suddenly been gone. And so when I showed up here, there was not that light had been gone. So I knew something wasn't right. But you can become very intoxicated with, as one of the students said this morning to me, about, you can become intoxicated, and not, these aren't his words, but this is his word, with your self-righteousness. And that I was self-righteously upset about race and society and the war and all sorts of things. And that became sort of more important than the faith that I'd had. It sort of displaced it. And over the years, though, in Jefferson City, which was a great place, because if you've ever been to Jeff, there wasn't a whole lot going on. And it gave you a chance to think about things. And I come from a tradition where reflection and contemplation is really important. And I love the contemplative life. I could go back to that sort of any time. But it allowed me to think about things. And yeah, there was consternation. But someone said, "Why did I come back to the church?" And then my glib answer is always, life happens to you. And there are these challenges that I have to learn how to deal with. And I saw myself not becoming the person I wanted to be, the good person, the person who, when you see someone who needs help, you're there. Not as a matter of service or anything, but as a matter of, this is a fellow human being, and it's the right thing to do. There was a joy that was missing that I'd grown up with. My grandparents always had that joy no matter what. And so I just went back to it. But yeah, I had long, dark periods of doubt. And then I have all these good kids. I mean, there's nothing like the joy of law clerks. You know it, Guido. There's nothing like it. I mean, I have 4 new kids every year, and there's a freshness to it. They show me, they have this wonderful outlook on life. And, people think it's sort of a platitude, but I have Mara and I, we talked. There was a joy. There was a happiness to it. So they gave me, it was that light, it was that goodness that I wanted back in my life. Not sort of like imposing it on society, not being angry with people, not preaching at people, but just living life in a positive and good way. It's literally, that's it. I mean, because there are a lot of reasons for me to be mean and angry. And that got old. Walking around this building in combat boots and waiting for this imaginary revolution and being bitter about this and bitter about that. Boy, I had all kinds of things I found to be bitter about. Snow, the sun, the rain. Anyway, that's a longer answer than you wanted, but I was glad to have my faith back. I'm delighted to have it back.
I got to say that my own trip back to faith was based on my not being a person that I thought I should be. And looking back now on some of the things that troubled me that I wasn't doing, they were trivial. But they bothered me terribly, and I knew I needed something more to bring joy and to be with them.
I mean, you're right, Guido, but there were some things that were big, too. I mean, the bitterness, I was more consumed with revolution than I was with going home to visit my grandparents. And any of you, I tell my law clerks, and each one of them will tell you independently, I tell them, go home. Because when they're not there, the clerks, there was a group of kids today said that they were going to come to D.C. on March 30. Well, as soon as they said that, there was that sort of thing that happens inside of you. March 30 is a horrible day. I mean, I'll see them because they're there, but that's the day my grandfather died. So there's a finality to that. There's that you didn't go home because you were waiting on the revolution, and you weren't a good person. And so you sort of think, I've got to be a better person, and you try to tell your kids that don't do what I did. That's not good. Go home. And there are reasons to be a better person. We talk about it. It's important to me. It's exactly what you said. I was not the person I wanted to be.
Jack, you were known as St. John in the Senate. Not necessarily to your person, but behind your back, that's what you were known. So did St. John have doubts?
Sure. No, I mean, I see through a glass darkly, and I think doubt is sort of the other side of faith, and so you make the leap of faith, and yeah, I mean, I'm always in dread of people asking me a theological question, because my answer is going to be so darn thin. So, sorry, Dean. But yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, that's faith, I mean, it's just believing. It's deciding you're going to believe, and I think there's always a lack of clarity about it. Somebody gave me a quote that the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright said, and he said, I've got good news and bad news. He said, the good news is that my theology is correct 75% of the time. The bad news is I'm not sure which 25% is wrong. Personally, yeah, I mean, when I was in New Haven, I had vocational doubts because I was at Yale Divinity School, and when I was there, I thought, well, maybe I'm supposed to be in the parish ministry, and then it didn't take long for me to realize that would have been an awful mismatch. I would have just been the world's worst pastor. So I reverted into something that I thought I could do, which was go to law school. And but that was a big question. What should I do with my life? And I was asked that today by some of the students here. How do you make a decision about vocation, about what you do? And I think that you sort of play it by ear, and it's what feels right, and I think that's how the Holy Spirit works. You just have a sense, this is what I should be doing with my life. So yeah, and as far as being a good person is concerned, oh my gosh, St. Jack, oh, what a laugh that is. It's ridiculous. And anybody, ask Sally, it's crazy. But I think, isn't that part of it? I mean, what kind of a person would it be who would be so sanctimonious as to think, wow, I really am God's gift to the world. So it's like the centurion, Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof. And I think that sense of unworthiness must be what is in the heart of a faithful person.
What role, Jack, did ambition play in your life? Because as someone who worried about vocation, That's a different orientation from you waiting on a call versus this is what I want and I'm going to go out and get it.
Well, when I was 10 or 11 years old, I was sitting, my parents took my brother and me to Washington, and we sat in the Senate gallery, and I looked down, and I said to myself, I want to do that sometime. So I was ambitious. I really wanted to be in politics. Specifically, at a young age, I wanted to be in the Senate. I remember that from that time, and I also remember verbatim what my dad said as we were leaving the Senate gallery, which was, "What a bunch of windbags." So, yeah, sure. Yeah, the ambition and the desire to succeed, very, very much, yeah.
Let me turn that back to you. What role did ambition play in your life?
I was too confused to be ambitious. I came here to go back to Savannah, which was just a different way of the vocation I thought I had, to be in Maryknoll, then to be a missionary, then to just be a parish priest. I thought I would love to have been a parish priest. But the only thing I really, when I look back on my life, the only goal I really had that was tangible was to be a priest. Beyond that, I can't really think of it. Well, I wanted to play in the NFL, but their ability was clearly not there. Then I wanted to be in the NBA, but the ability and size clearly was not there. But those were fantasies more than ambition. But beyond that, I really can't say I've had ambition. It was always the vocation.
It's kind of interesting looking at students, because there are students every year who already know where they want to go, what they want to do. Joe Lieberman was known as Senator Joe through his 3 years in law school. I mean, that was his ambition in a very good sense. That was what he wanted to do. Bill Clinton was thought of as being governor of Arkansas, not beyond that, but to that extent, yeah. There are others instead who feel called to something and don't yet know quite what it is, but at some point, something tells them, this is what I want to do, which is good, fun, and useful. And if you can put those together, then you come out, and then ambition is a plus, because it helps you to accomplish that. Well, to turn from the personal to the broadest, my next question is, do you believe that there is a role for religion, that religion should play a role in politics and law? I don't mean about you yourself, but just generally. And if so, what should it be? Kathy Caveni, a Yale Law School graduate, a professor at Notre Dame, and now at Boston College of Law and Theology, has termed two types of religion, one the prophetic and the other pastoral. Should that role, if there is one in public life, be prophetic, pastoral, or both? By prophetic, I mean something like this: the role that religion played in the anti-slavery movement, in the civil rights movement, in the abortion movement, anti-abortion movement or gay movement today. That is, you can have that prophetic role from one side or another, in some things or not, but it is prophetic and was powerfully so. The pastoral instead says, well, we all agree that one doesn't enter the kingdom of heaven by writing the costs of accidents, or any great books. Even all of Bruce Ackerman's books are not going to get him into the kingdom of heaven. We all know that you get into the kingdom of heaven, if you do it all, by feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and then there are great differences among people in how to go about this. What is the way to do it? Is it better to do it through government? Is it better to do it individually? And that the role in religion in public life is to make people come together, understand that the other wants to do the same thing, but may want to do it differently. These are two profoundly different ways of seeing religion in public life. And each might play a role. I'd like to know which you think it should be, and if you think it's both, how do you know when it should be one and when the other? This is a tough one. I know you've been writing about it, so I'll ask Jack first.
I'm on the pastoral, heavily on the pastoral side of that scale. In America today, it's possible to conceive of a situation where, let's say, Nazi Germany or racist United States, or situations where a very confrontational approach is necessary. But the prophets of Israel spoke for God. This wasn't just, here's my opinion on this or that. They would start their prophecy, they would say, thus says the Lord. They were speaking for God, normally on behalf of disadvantaged people or against idolatry, the confusion with the Canaanite religion, but they were God's spokesmen. But I think that the basic one of the projects of the United States has been to hold together in one country very different people. And that was true at the beginning. That was the reason for the main body of our Constitution. And it is even more necessary today because the country is so much bigger and so much more complex, and there's so many different points of view, and there's so many different interests represented. So holding things together and holding people together, I think, is the project of our country, and I think it's also the meaning of religion. What the root of the word religion is the same as the root of the word ligament. It has to do with binding things together. And in the New Testament, the notion that in Christ all things hang together. To me, that's a very important religious value, and it's a very important value in the United States. And I think that the problem with the prophetic point of view is that it says in politics, here is my political perspective, and this can be true from both the left and the right, and it is true from both the left and the right. It's true from the right with the social issues, abortion, gay marriage, and so on. It's true from the left, from people who believe that religion compels them to specific governmental policies on, say, dealing with poverty. But the problem with it is that once you say, my political position that I'm advancing, I'm doing so in the name of God, this is really God's position, that closes out debate. That says to people who do not agree with you, well, it's either God's side, which happens to be my side, or it's your side, which is not God's side. That makes it impossible to come together as a country, to hold ourselves together as a country, and it makes impossible what's absolutely necessary in politics, which is compromise.
Well, I haven't given it as much thought as Jack, but I'd like to ask you a question, follow-up question, Jack. I know it's kind of unfair. So what would you tell Frederick Douglass on slavery?
I was thinking that you don't ask questions.
I'm glad you asked.
Just a slight edit, Jack. I don't ask irrelevant, useless questions.
Like some justices you can name.
Speak no evil.
Nope, yes. Moderator steps in.
No, I think, what I'm saying is not sort of a universal proposition. It's just that I am heavily on the side of the pastoral rather than the prophetic. But there's an historic context. Frederick Douglass confronting slavery, opposition to slavery, very important, obviously prophetic. On the other hand, Lincoln's primary goal wasn't confronting slavery, it was holding together the country, the Union. And I just think that's really important. And today, it's not, slavery, but it's really a question of public policy, which is debatable. I mean, issues of how big the government should be, how far it should reach, how high taxes should be, what spending should be. The basic issues in America today are ones on which honest people have different opinions. And I think that the point of our system, the point of our structure, is to have a place to hold together all these different points of view and somehow work them out. And I think to take the prophetic point of view, unless it's clearly warranted, if there's just some obviously, to you and me, grave injustice, but in the ordinary flow of politics, I think that is very counterproductive.
There is that great abolitionist hymn, the poem by Lowell, "Once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide in the strife twixt truth and falsehood for the good or evil side. And 'tis then the brave man chooses, while the coward stands aside, till the multitudes make virtue of the truth they had denied." Now that is tremendously prophetic by Lowell before the Civil War. There are times when that is so. The people who stood up to Nazism, to fascism, who gave up a great deal. I mean, my father, a conservative person, became, in a way, a revolutionary. He left because you couldn't live that way. Now, do you leave or do you fight? On the other hand, to make everything or most things a prophetic matter means the nation cannot stand together.
But how do you choose when to make it prophetic and when to make it pastoral?
Yes, and and the question is, I think Jack is quite right, that the tendency to go to the prophetic so quickly, as we have been doing recently, and to say the people on the other side are not just wrong but bad, they are not trying for the same thing, is destructive of a country. It cannot keep it. But there are times when we're summoned to more.
So would this have been your reaction to the social gospel movement?
Well, I tend to pay more attention to the famous footnote 5 of Aquinas, which says there are some things which are wrong, but which you do not want to forbid, because it does more harm to do so than to say they're wrong but not forbid them and go along. Now, that's...
there's a lot hidden in these footnotes.
Well, Justice Breyer doesn't like footnotes, but I kind of like them. I kind of like them.
I'm just kidding. I have nothing to say.
I think that, I'm just thinking about current politics.
Yeah.
And not sort of hypothetical situations that may come up or historically have come up, but current politics. And current politics in America is broken. And it's broken because there are pressures on politicians to be absolutists and not to compromise on anything, hold that line. So if you were in my party and you want to win a primary election, or say in Iowa, you are pressed by the people who show up in the Iowa caucuses to hold very, very rigid lines. And this is what's happened, I think, in American politics. And I wanted, this could be kind of an aside, but it's just a good story about how politics used to be practiced. And this happened when I first went to the U.S. Senate. I was just 40 years old, and I was one of 38 Republicans in the Senate, and 38 is nothing, you know, it's just zilch. And I was on the Senate Finance Committee, and I showed up on the committee the first day I was there, and Russell Long, the consummate politician, was the chairman of the Finance Committee. And the Finance Committee was at work writing a letter to the Budget Committee on what's our plan for the year ahead. This is 1977. I had just sat down, was there for about an hour, and there was a little pause in the proceedings, and I raised my hand. Russell Long had never seen me before. And I said, "Mr. Chairman, I have an idea." And he looked down the length of the table at this minority person he'd never seen before, Republican non-entity kid he'd never seen before, and he said, "Oh, what's your idea?" Well, and I'm a Republican, and I said, "I think we should have a tax cut." And he said, "How much of a tax cut?" Well, I hadn't thought about that. And so I said, $5 billion, which, you know, in 1977 it was worth something. I said, $5 billion just came into my head. And he said, "All right, is there any objection?" And nobody said anything. And he said, "All right, that's agreed to." And I thought, wow, this is going to be great. I went back to my office and cranked out press releases. First day on the job, I've got you a $5 billion tax cut. I'd done nothing of the kind. It was just a letter, and Russell Long knew that. But here's the question. Why did he do that? Why did he do that for me? He knew what was going to happen. He knew that I was going to crank out a press release. He did it to make me look good. And he did it to make me look good because he wanted to include in the work of his committee every member, even the most junior Republican on his committee. He wanted to include us. That is how politics worked. And it's a very big lesson. It's a funny story, but it's a very big lesson about what politics is. Politics is bringing people in. It's working things out. It's not marginalizing people. And I think what's happened in politics today is it's gone the other way. And it's become very, very ideological, very, very purist, very, very uncompromising, very partisan. And as a result, it just doesn't work the way it should.
So essentially what you're saying, there may be times for the prophetic, but most of the time in politics, the pastoral role of religion is better, and that today, especially, given the state of politics, the pastoral role should dominate, that is what is needed more than anything else. Well, I'd have lots of other questions, and one in particular about, now I will say, Justice Thomas's quite brilliant opinion reversing me in town of Greece. It wasn't the main opinion. The main opinion was by Justice Kennedy, but I didn't understand that opinion. I understood what Justice Thomas was saying.
Well, that's because he doesn't use footnotes.
And it may be that we will come back to that, but I received questions from students, and I would like to ask the questions that the students have asked, and these have not been vetted to our speakers, and so here they are. I will ask them. The first one is, can one be a Christian in public service and support the death penalty? In text, Christ was fairly clear in the Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere about forgiving our trespassers, yet many politicians identifying as Christians continue to support the death penalty. As one writer puts it, to be a Christian and support the death penalty is a complete contradiction because nobody is beyond redemption. How does a Christian wrestle with and reconcile our instincts to punish with a Christ-given mandate to forgive? This comes from a student, a toughie. Well, you think about
You know, as I said, I generally thought that I should not and didn't draw a connection between what I believed and particular policies. I think that the closest I came to drawing that connection was in the death penalty, because when I had a chance in the Senate to vote on that, I voted against it. When I was Attorney General, however, and when our office tried capital cases, I supported it because that was, my job was that of the lawyer for the state rather than the unilateral maker of government policy. Well, to me, the death penalty was a mistake, is a mistake, very costly for the state to impose it. Sometimes it goes wrong. But for me to say that what strikes me as being bad policy is therefore against the will of God is excessive. I think it's arguable to have it. I'm not going to make the argument, but I believe that it is arguable to have the death penalty, at least in some cases. So to me, it turns out to be a policy question, even though I did have some moral problems with it myself.
Well, I'm in a different position. I'm where Jack was and more when he was Attorney General. But I think I don't think anybody relishes a death case, and it does something to you. Those cases are not, they do something to you. And you do your job, you live up to your oath, but you don't quite know what you would do if you had to impose it. These people, again, I used the word of that young man this morning about self-righteous. I think, Jack, that people can be absolutists without being religious, and they can be prophetic without speaking of religion. They can say, and they can be absolutists without thought on something like the death penalty. And sometimes people who don't have that responsibility say things as though the people who have it don't care. They're heartless, they're this, they're that. My goodness, anytime you get one of those, I mean, you always worry. I can remember some years ago, I don't know if you remember the case where the governor of Virginia, after the individual had been executed, he had a DNA done on his way out of office. And, you know, I can remember getting up in the middle of the night. Well, this guy, you know, he'd already been executed, but he'd always proclaimed his innocence. And I can remember getting up in the middle of the night wondering, you know, did we get it wrong, which is always your worst nightmare. And this is something that happened years before, and driving in earlier than I'd go in early anyway, sweating out this whole thing. And as soon as I got in, as soon as the first clerk got in, I asked them to go find the file, to go over it again. Because it always worries you that you have not done everything you're supposed to do, and that you may have gotten it wrong. Well, it turned out when they did the more, we had granted him the right at the time to have DNA, and it, you know, demonstrated then that he committed the crime. But the more sophisticated DNA said something like there was a 1 in 14 million chance that he wasn't the person. So it was pretty clear he was the person. Now that doesn't justify the death penalty, but it is, I'm just use that as an example of how much you worry about these things and how much it weighs on you. And it's not as easy, I think, sometimes as the critics say it is. I think you can ask, I know no judge who relishes those kind of cases. And I'm sure you didn't relish it as the Attorney General, but you did your job.
It's a question that is there. It's there as a lower court judge. I'm going to sit, I know because of our procedure, on a death case that is going to come to me in 8 or 9 months, because the briefs are written. We have very few, because Connecticut now doesn't have, New York doesn't have, and Vermont never has had. But this will come, and I'm already worrying about it. I mean, what can you do?
Well, I have Georgia, Florida, and Alabama.
Interestingly, this takes its place in literature. Billy Budd, written by Melville, has Captain Vere, Captain Truth, executing his favorite, Billy Budd. Melville was the son-in-law of Chief Justice Lemuel Shaw of Massachusetts. He was asking, what does a judge do in that kind of situation? It's there, and it's the hardest thing in the world. The next question doesn't have to do with religion, except religion of a particular sort, that of the Yale Law Journal. It says, Justice Thomas, to what extent do you personally find legal scholarship useful in shaping your view of the law and in solving legal problems? Does what scholars write in law review articles ever impact your way of thinking on legal issues? That's a very...
Well, I like the use of the word ever, because it gives you a lot of latitude. I think you would have to be in a sort of a hole someplace if you didn't say some scholarship is helpful. I tend to think that I go back to what I said at the beginning, I think I'm obligated to learn as much about what we do as possible. So yes, some scholarship is very helpful, but if the article is like thinking about thinking, that wouldn't be very helpful. But if it is about the contours of the Establishment Clause or our free exercise jurisprudence, if it's about the history of this, last night at dinner, I was absolutely fascinated by what you said about the establishment religions in Connecticut. That is what I'm interested in. What is it? I mean, what are the establishment religions? What role did they play? What were the debates about the Congregationalists, or about the Episcopals in Virginia, or about Catholics in Maryland? And what did the states think? What did the colonies think? I think those things inform, say, the Establishment Clause cases that you have. I think that's important. But, or let's say, for example, I'm really sort of interested now in public rights versus private rights, and how you adjudicate, how they're different in the law. That becomes really important. It's getting to be more and more important. I'm interested in where, for example, and this is all scholarship, where does deference come from? If you lead the run up to Chevron, where does that come from? Taught a course with a former clerk of mine down at the University of Georgia on federal common law. Why? Because I'm interested. Where does it come? I mean, why does Brandeis, you probably know this, but why does Brandeis overrule Swift v. Tyson when no one asked him to? What's the deal with that? And then what were some of the implications of Swift v. Tyson? Or why did Story, for example, believe in federal common law? You know, and if you pull all that sort of jurisprudence from commercial cases. So it's all interesting, and I can't spend all my time on it. But if you're going to sit on these cases that have broad implication, I think you're obligated by your oath to learn about these things. So yes, good scholarship is important. That's why I think when people do scholarship that's not credible or that's not constructive or is not thorough or is so driven by their sort of ideological view of what they think the world ought to look like, it's not helpful. So you really want honest brokers in scholarship. And if you come to my house, you see it's bad because I have all these things I have to read before, and it might just be one adverb in an opinion. But it's an important adverb. It's important to understand why. It's important for people who read these opinions to understand why. Why don't we cite Slaughterhouse? Why don't we say anything about the Privileges or Immunities Clause? I mean, I left Professor Thomas Emerson's class, wondering about that. Oh, it's just why? Why do we just forget about it? Oh, it's an old case. Well, that's not much of an explanation. It's like your parents telling you, do it because I say so. You know, I mean, you're owed an explanation. The people who read these opinions are owed an explanation. And it doesn't have to be the best, but I think scholarship is helpful. And I get excited about it. But I'm also interested in other things, like how did Lenin and Trotsky get back into Russia during I mean, that has a lot to do with substantive due process. But it's really interesting. I think good scholarship is critical to what we do. You know it. I mean,
Yeah. Well, and law clerks are extraordinarily useful because they keep you in contact with what is happening in the academy. They tell you, so-and-so has written this. This might be relevant to what you're doing. Whether you then end up citing that article or not, but you read it.
well, you know, we actually do quite a bit of it. The best part of the job of my kids, because they'll do it. They have the horsepower to do it, the interest to do it. They're honest, and they go find it. And of course, so we do read quite a bit. And even if it never shows up or we don't write separately, it certainly informs our understanding of what we're doing.
The next question is to you again, but I think both can speak to it. How do your beliefs about racial justice inform your judicial decision-making? Have your views on the role of government in achieving social change evolved since you've been on the bench? If so, how?
I'm trying to get my head around there are lots, that's hard in the sense that I don't know how to define all these terms. I think I'm more, say, with someone like Harlan, that I think the Constitution required certain things. For example, if you go back and see what I attempted to say, even in the McDonald concurrence, I just tried to set out what I think the Constitution requires. You see that in a lot of the race-based cases where I don't just say this is right because I think it's right, but I try to explain it. But you know, terms, I mean, maybe you understand, how would you use a term like social justice when you're trying to decide a case?
I'm just giving you what the student's question is.
Well, that's kind of bailing out on me.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Sorry.
No, many of these terms, but you've already given, you know, in a very strong sense, the answer. that you look to what the law requires you to do. You look to the Constitution. We look both to the Constitution and also the decisions of a higher court. You don't have to look to a higher court, but you do have to look to the Constitution, and then that's what you start with.
Well, I tried. Thank you, but I realized I was just mumbling to myself up here. It is really important to me to live up to my oath. And I think this Constitution, there are certain provisions in the Constitution that were post-Civil War that was written to deal with the freemen at that time. And I think I'm obligated to determine exactly what was meant by that to the best of my abilities. I can assure you, this goes back to the scholarship argument or question. We looked for everything we can find, from the amicus briefs to, I feel badly for my law clerks. I saw one of my kids last few weeks. I went by her office, and you couldn't see her because the entire top of her desk was maybe a couple of feet high in books that she had to pull in because I have a question about one word. And we have to figure it out. And I said, I almost felt guilty, but then I went to Mass and I was okay. But it is really a big deal with me to try to get it right. The other thing that we do is I tell my kids that we are not writing the gospel. And everything we do, we could be wrong. And that's from last year. And when you get a new set of clerks, you say we are obligated to go back and ask the question, do you think we were right? And where were we wrong? And why? And then we'll go back and just rethink that and look at the arguments on the other side again. And I think that when people talk about faith, I think we are required to do this job in a way that to accept our fallibility.
Jack, did your views on racial justice affect you in the Senate?
Sure. Yeah, I was the author of the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which overturned 5 or 6 Supreme Court cases on discrimination on the basis of hiring. So yeah, if you believe that inclusion of people is a national purpose, and that a sense of alienation is a big problem in our country, and it's clearly the case. Yes, you try to address racial issues as best you can.
But do you think we could do it without the statute?
Well, you did. You all these.
Oh, not we. I
crazy
wasn't
cases.
there. You said 91.
Well,
I don't.
whoever these people were on the
I have no idea who they are.
But here really is the difference of 3 different things. The question the student asked was a student and academic question in many ways, with terms then to be argued out in class and so on. Clarence gave an answer as a judge as to what you do when you face cases of that sort. Jack gave an answer as a legislator. But of course, these things are. It doesn't mean that each of us isn't affected by these, but how we do them is part of our roles. And our role, ultimately, the oath we take, whether we take an oath as a professor or not, but the oath we take helps to shape how we deal with these issues, and it's going to be different.
Well, that's why I asked him, could you do it without the statute? And, we're there to interpret the Constitution. There are lots of things, if I could do it on a blank slate, there are lots of things I would do differently. But you don't. You have to stay within the confines of your role as a judge. Again, that's by obligation, it's by oath, and it's certainly by the structure of the separation of powers in our country.
But that brings again to the notion of it. There may be different philosophies of what the Constitution means and what it doesn't, and depending on the philosophy that you have picked, then that determines what you can do. Justice Black said that most justices will pick a philosophy that allows them to come among plausible philosophies, that allows them to come out right most of the time. And he said, Felix Frankfurter picked one philosophy, I picked another one, and it makes us comfortable most of the time, but then there will be cases where I decide in a way that I don't want to because my philosophy requires it. Now, on philosophies, that brings me back to, and I'd like to finish on this before we go to the reception, back to the issue that I tried to deal with in Town of Greece, and that is a big issue, and that is between law and religion, is how free should people be to define themselves religiously when such definitions inevitably exclude or put down someone else. The Constitution denied that self-definition at the national level. It said nationally, we cannot define ourselves, no establishment. But it allowed that at the state level. The states could continue to be Connecticut Congregational, Virginia Episcopalian, and so on. Sometime in the middle, in Connecticut in 1835, we disestablished, but we remained substantially congregational even then. Sometime after the Civil War, not clear when or how, this came to apply, no establishment, to the states. How far beyond does one go that? Does a municipality have a right to define itself as essentially religious, of one religion? There are towns in New York that are essentially Orthodox Jewish. Could a town in Michigan define itself as essentially Mohammedan? Can a town like Town of Greece define itself, if it did, as being Christian? Well, if you go beyond towns, how about neighborhoods? How about firms? How about individuals? When can an individual define herself or himself, and why? Knowing that if you define yourself, you're always excluding somebody else. You're always saying somebody else does not belong. I don't want to deal, my religion says Orthodox Jewish, and my religion says I cannot sit next to a woman on an airplane. That's self-definition. Is that permitted? No, that's not a municipality. It's not anything. So at what level? The interesting thing about Supreme Court in reversing my opinion, 5-4 in Town of Greece, as I said, had an opinion by Justice Kennedy that said, well, they didn't really mean it, the Town of Greece, and it was just a small town, so they didn't know what they were doing. I didn't take much pleasure in that. I didn't understand what Justice Thomas, in a dissent, said establishment and no establishment was in the Constitution as to nation. Was it really there as to states and municipalities? He asked the question of how far down you go. So what's the answer? How far down do you go?
Well, I don't think I asked it that way, how far you go. I think what I was saying was I didn't think that it was incorporated.
Yeah.
And hence applied against the state and local governments. Now, what you don't include in your question is the fact that the state governments, for the most part, have constitutional provisions that limit the state's involvement with religions. So I think virtually every state has that limitation. So the question you're asking has to do with the national constitution, not with the state constitutions. Maybe it works out differently depending on where you are. But my beef is not with that sort of broader question. It's with how do we incorporate, and if you go back, the Establishment Clause was incorporated where? Was it Everson?
Yep.
And what is it, 2 lines? And then it cites like free exercise cases. And that's really more my problem. And, you know, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. So I see it more, as I said, in Jefferson Parish and some of the other cases, I see that more as kind of a federalism provision that, granted, if I give you free exercise, that this is about individual rights and similar to speech, if I concede that, then where do you put the Establishment Clause? I know the argument. It's that somehow it affects free exercise, but I don't think that was a reason. Because this was such a problem with me, I spent like a week at Notre Dame with Drakeman and Hamburger and Munoz and Rick Garnett, teaching just this point because it bothered me so much. And it required you, again, to dig through all these cases, all the old cases in the history. And I'm still where I was before. I just don't see the incorporation. Now, I can see the broader question, how far we should go, but I don't see how it's incorporated.
You don't think that the Constitution actually, that this actually happened,
Yeah.
but why was the speech part of the First Amendment incorporated and the religion part not?
I didn't incorporate it. I'm still hung up on Congress shall make no law.
Yeah.
And so, but I'm willing to concede that for the sake of discussion. But I don't think you can use that as an argument against my position on the Establishment Clause, because I would, as a matter of first principles, I guess, I would like to discuss that with you too, like why is it incorporated? Now, I'm not saying it's a good idea or a bad idea, but why? And in fact, I would go further. Where does this doctrine of incorporation come from? What are its contours? What's the basis of it? You see what I'm saying? Those are questions I had with Thomas Emerson. And I still haven't figured it all out. So I went back and reread a bunch of the incorporation cases again recently because they're still bothering me. And it's, when I teach it, I teach a con law course. When you have law clerks, you can like be the roaming teacher, and teach all these things that you're interested in. But I teach at GW for each semester too. And so we go back and look at some of these cases, But again, I'm not arguing just as a matter of, say, sort of political science or political theory, like how far down you go. My problem is really how much do you incorporate and where does this come from?
Well, I'm very interested in the issue of the Establishment Clause, but I honestly am not interested in the question of incorporation. I think I know what you said on it. I do read occasional cases. I just took that as sort of a settled issue, but to me, the question is sort of Guido's idea of creating feelings of exclusion by, as he says, the drumbeat of relentless drumbeat of one version of religion presenting itself in a public forum.
Yeah.
And it had to do with sort of feelings of exclusion. I do think feelings of exclusion is a very important subject. But to me, the question is, well, who who polices it. And it's really a question of can versus should. And I think that it's up to each of us to be very sensitive in not creating a sense that some people are on the outs. And that's a very big deal in this country. And I myself, I was once asked to give the prayer at the Yale commencement, and I gave a specifically Christian prayer, and I think that was wrong, because this was all kinds of people who were there, and it was up to me personally, Jack Danforth, to be sensitive to the diversity of people there. But I think, to me, to make this feeling of exclusion an establishment clause matter is kind of stretching it a bit.
Stretching what?
Stretching it a bit to elevate something as trivial. I mean, Kennedy called it ceremonial prayer. So ceremonial prayer is kind of nothing. And I don't understand why the advocates of public prayer are so enthusiastic about something that's just ceremonial. On the other hand, I wonder about sort of the princess and the pea being a judicial doctrine, and how this ever gets to court. I mean, it seems to me it should be sort of a standing type issue, that this is so frivolous that I don't think that, I mean, I think maybe a judge might see this as being terribly offensive, but I doubt that the ordinary citizen listening to some formality at the beginning of a town meeting would view it as just something that's an affront. I just really doubt that would be the reasonable, objective person, as opposed to sort of what you think the reasonable, objective person might think.
But he couldn't say that. Justice Kennedy couldn't say that. He wrote Lee versus Weissman, and that was just somebody sitting next to somebody, and you know, he felt, and that was a free exercise case, but his argument was that was coercion.
He thought in this case that in this town of Greece, he thought that actual coercion, you did too, in your opinion, but. That's what I think. I think that Guido's really right in the sensitivity that we should have, but it seems to me that policing that sensitivity is not justiciable.
There are two or three different things. One is, at what one level ought one to define oneself, ought to be allowed to define oneself. The next is, who gets excluded? And are they groups that have been traditionally treated badly, so that sensitivity of exclusion is something that we should worry about? Our history of race is that when we exclude somebody on the basis of race, that's much worse than other things, I think. And the third is the self-definition trivial? Is it something that really ought to bother, or is it not? Recently, the Second Circuit has said it is no problem for a town to allow, or public utilities to allow, a certain area to be defined in a place where Orthodox or highly religious Jewish people can walk. That doesn't exclude many people very much in any way. It just is a way of saying. Quite different if you're talking about education, and there's another. How we put these together, I don't know. We have an example of something across the street. The Grove Street Cemetery, built by Hill House, a great figure at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, one of the earliest anti-slave people, wanted that cemetery to be open to all. He wanted a symbol of religion, but didn't want it to be anything that anybody could claim. So he made it Neo-Egyptian because there were no Egyptians in New Haven at the time. He then said every plot is owned in fee individually, so that people in their own plots could define themselves as much as they wanted. And so you can have a plot which has Stars of David, huge number of Trowbridges, had crosses all over the place. They were Episcopalians, but they outdid any Catholics in their crucifixes or other things that were there. Now, that's fine for a cemetery. Can that work for a nation? I don't know. Anyway, it is 6 o'clock. Time for us to eat and drink. I just want to close by saying again to my students, I think you see why I am so proud, so very proud of these 2 kids of mine, and why I hope that in 40 years and 52 years, I will be able to be as proud of you. Thank you all.